Hello and welcome to my tutorial for a Fog of War implementation for 2D games on Unity. I decided to make this tutorial because I couldn't really find that many resources about this subject online, so let's start. I have created a new 2D project on Unity. We're using Unity 2019.2.9. I did go ahead and bring in a few sprites beforehand. So we have like a brick tile here, we also have a grass tile and our player character. But most importantly, you want a white, completely white circle with a transparent background. So let's start by bringing in the grass. I'm gonna rename it to field. And we're also gonna make it a tiled sprite. So this is gonna be our playing field. I'm gonna make it 800 by 100. That seems like a good size for it. We're also going to bring in the player. It's the sorting order for the player to 1, so it's actually on top of the grass. Add a component. Let's add a script for the player. I'm just going to call it player. We're going to keep this short. Both of these scripts, we're going to make one for the player, for the movement, and one for the camera, so it actually follows the player. For the player, we're just going to create a public float movement speed and initialize it at like 8. In the update method, we're gonna create a movement vector to get the input from the player to actually move the sprite around the screen. So obviously for the x-axis we're gonna use the horizontal input, and for the y-axis we're gonna use vertical, and 0 for the Z. I like using vector 3 for this. That removes unneeded casting between vector 2s and vector 3s. So we're just going to add the movement vector to transform that position, and that's going to move our player around. One thing we want to do here, I almost forgot, is actually multiply this by movement speed and also time that delta time. So for the camera, let's add a component for the camera as well, a new script. Let's just call it camera, I guess. Open it up. We're gonna be needing a reference for the player here at least. And let's get the reference in the start method. Find the player's game object. Set the transform as the reference, and in the update method we're just gonna set our position, as in the camera's position, to vector 3. Take the player's x and player's y, where I'm writing y position, and also set the z value below 0. Also, because we're moving the player in the update method, we actually want to update the camera in the late updates. And that should be it for the movements. There we go. Nice. Alrighty. We're gonna create a new folder in the assets. Let's create a folder for the render textures we're going to be using for the Fog of War. We're gonna create a new render texture inside of this, and we'll call it Fog of War main. We're going to be needing 2 render textures, 2 cameras to render the Fog of War, and also a shader. We'll get to the shader a little bit later. I'm going to set the initial size of the render texture to 512. We're probably going to change this around later. Depth buffer to no. Filter mode to point. We don't need those, so just duplicate it by Ctrl D. Rename it to Fog of War. The second one, let's rename it to Fog of War secondary. We're gonna have the same properties on this one. So 2 of these. Now we're also gonna create 2 cameras. Let's call the first one Fog of War main camera. I'm gonna set the clear flags to don't clear. Culling mask to nothing for now. Projection to orthographic. And remove the audio listeners. We don't want multiple audio listeners. We're also gonna drag in the Fog of War main render texture to the target texture field here. Let's duplicate this one as well with Control D. And we'll call the second one Fog of War secondary camera. On this one, we want to set the clear flags to solid color and set it all the way to black. 0, 0, 0, alpha also 0 as the color. Column mask nothing for now and replace the target texture with the Fog of War secondary. So Fog of War main camera has the Fog of War main render texture and the Fog of War secondary camera has the Fog of War secondary render texture. Next thing we want to do is create 2 new layers. So our Fog of War cameras won't be rendering anything unnecessary. So let's create a Fog of War main and also a Fog of War secondary layer. And now we want to set the column masks accordingly. So for the main camera, that's actually rendering the actual game. We're gonna remove the Fog of War main and also the Fog of War secondary layers for this column mask. For the Fog of War main camera, we want to set the column mask in Fog of War main only. So only this one here. And for the Fog of War secondary camera, we want to set the column mask as only the Fog of War secondary. For the sizes of the camera, you also want to reset the position, obviously to 0 and 0. And let's put the Z to -10 as well. The size, because we're rendering a square shaped texture, 512, 512. The fill is also a square. We want to put the size as half of the size of the fill. So because the fill size is 100, we're gonna set 50 to the size of the cameras. And as you can see, it aligns perfectly with the field. We're also gonna create a new UI element called raw image. And this is gonna be our the actual Fog of War rendered on top of everything else. I'm gonna call the canvas it created for us as Fog of War canvas. We're gonna set the render mode of this canvas to well space. Reset the position to 0 and 0. Width and height we should leave alone. And then we want to the event camera, we want to be using the main camera, so just drag that in. We want to create a new sorting layer. Let's call this Fog of War. So it definitely gets rendered on top of everything else. And that's it for this camera. We still need to change things about this raw image. I'm gonna rename it to just Fog of War. Let's just rename it to Fog of War. Set the position to 0 and 0 as well. And as you can see, now it's actually rendering a white blank canvas on top of our game. So it's working as we want it to work. But we don't want to render a white canvas. What we want to render is the Fog of War main render texture. So drag that into the texture and you can see now it's not rendering anything. And that's because our render textures don't have anything in them, or the Fog of War main texture doesn't have anything in them. But we need to put something in there. So let's take the circle, drag a circle as a child of the player. This is gonna be the field of vision of the player. So let's make it a little bit bigger. I think around 2, maybe even a little bit bigger than that. 2.2, 2.2 seems like a good value to me. And this circle you want to set in absolute red. Red as 1, green as 0, blue 0, alpha as 1. This is important. I'm gonna rename the Fog of War main circle. What I'm also gonna do is change the layer to Fog of War main. Now you can see, you can actually see it, if I have it on default layer, it's a little bit when I change the layer to Fog of War main, it gets more pixelated. That's because our render texture is still quite small. What we want to do next is duplicate this with Ctrl D again. Rename this second circle to Fog of War secondary circle. Remember to change the layer to Fog of War secondary. And then we're going to change the color value to complete blue. So 0 on the red, 0 on the green, 1 on the blue, and 1 on the alpha. And if we hit play now, we'll just see we'll have a red circle, but it's leaving like a trail behind. So we could just fill the whole area with the red. But that's not really what we want. And this is where the shader comes in. Shader, we want to change the colors and the alpha values of the rendered texture we're printing. Obviously, we don't want a red. We want the red part of the circle to be completely transparent. What we need to do is create a new image effects shader here. So create shader and image effect. If you're anything like me, you find shaders really intimidating, but luckily this one is pretty simple. So I'm gonna rename it Fog of War and open it up in Visual Studio. And first things, we want to create another texture here. So we have the main texture property. Let's create a secondary texture property. This way we can blend both render textures and blend the colors within them. You'll see it makes sense soon. So I'm just gonna call the first one main texture and the second one secondary texture. We'll get rid of this. We have to add a tag here though. So tags and curly braces. And what we need to add is Q equals transparent +1. This is what makes the sprites to be actually rendered with their sorting layer order, and instead of their Z. If you do not add this, sprites will be rendered by their Z-axis, and that's not what you want with a 2D game. You want to be able to use the sorting layer system Unity has within the sprite renderer components. We also want this shader to apply transparency, so we'll add blend src alpha 1 minus source alpha. Save that. Outside of this is pretty basic stuff. I'm not gonna go over this. There's a lot of good tutorials about shaders on YouTube. What we want is a reference to the secondary texture as well. Let's double check that I wrote the name correctly. I did. And now we are gonna blend the two textures by adding them together. So we have our main texture and also our secondary here. So it's adding the colors from both textures together, and we need to create them. Like, we're gonna test this shader for now. It's not ready just yet, but let's see if it works at least somewhat. So let's create a new material from this shader. You want to click on the shader and create a material from it, so it will automatically use that shader on the newly created material. I'm gonna go with Fog of War as well. For the main texture, we want to use the Fog of War main texture. For the secondary texture, we want to use the Fog of War secondary texture. And on here, if you remember, we created the raw image, the Fog of War canvas, and below it is the raw image. On the material, you want to use the Fog of War material. And you can see, first is red, but if you remember correctly, we create a red and a blue circle. So now when we use this material on it, it blends the blue and red colors together, and well, red and blue equals purple. What you can also see now, it's actually only leaving a red trail behind it. That's because because of the cameras, we have the main cameras don't clear. The secondary camera keeps clearing it every frame. So if we check the render textures, you can see the red one, the red circle, keeps leaving the trail behind, but the secondary doesn't. So what this does is it's only, the blue circle is only here all the time, but the red circle keeps leaving the trail because the render texture doesn't clear the texture. So you might be getting the idea here now. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna start changing the colors and the alpha values of the colors. What we want to return, obviously, is just black color, but with different alphas. And at first I was thinking that I should just go with if statements that if colors red values over certain value return a certain color. But according to several sites, conditional rendering is bad in shaders. So what we want to do is we want to think about it for a moment. So like let's like, if we have a circle with the red value as 1 and the blue value as 1, but we want the alpha value to be 0 because we want that circle to be completely transparent. The other one is red is 0. Sorry, red is 1 and blue is 0. And we want the alpha to be, let's say, 0.5. So it's like a fog border. It's somewhat transparent, but not completely. And then obviously the one where red is 0 and blue is also 0. We want an alpha value. Basically anything else, the alpha value is going to be 1. So an easy way to solve this would be set the alpha value of the color to 2.0 f. So 2 is the maximum number you can get from these values because red 1 plus 1 is 2. Duh. So you want to, you might think that you could just remove the red value and the blue value, and it would work on the first one because you would get 0 because 2 minus 1 minus 1 would equal 0, but it wouldn't work on the second one because that would leave us 1 because 2 minus 1 minus 0 is 1. What we want to do here though is let's multiply the red value by 1.5 and let's multiply the blue value with 0.5. So now 2 minus 1.5 minus 0.5 is 0. 2 minus 1.5 because is 0.5, and because the blue value is 0, it's 2 minus 1.5 minus 0.5, so 0.5. And this is just gonna be 2 minus 0 minus 0, but any value over 1 is gonna be turned into 1. So what we're gonna return here is the fixed 4, 0, 0, 0, and the alpha value we get from this. And now we return. We're getting an error because I have made a mistake somewhere. Yeah, I didn't return a fixed 4. I tried to return a fixed. So now we are still getting an error. No, we're not. Okay, good. So now, as you can see, we have a working fog of war. The field of vision is clearer, but you're also leaving the actual fog in the areas you have been to, but all the areas you haven't been to are completely black. So this is as simple as it gets. Now we're gonna get to the render texture. The size of the render, you can see this is pretty pixelated. Like the size of the render texture obviously affects how pixelated this is. So if we put a really low value, we get a really like, this could look pretty cool on like a tile-based game. A turn-based, like tile-based game, but like you want to use somewhat of a high number. I don't know how much this affects performance, to be honest, but you can easily put like 2048, and it's already a pretty good looking circle. And it doesn't appear to do anything like performance-wise. It's still running completely smoothly. But like, I have to be honest, I haven't tested this too much. But yeah, some things I still want to show you is, by the way, you probably want to put this off from the scene view so it's not blocking your whole game. One thing I wanted to show is if you want to have like field of vision blockers, it's also doable with this method. Let's bring some bricks. I'm gonna create a empty object here. Call it wall. So we're gonna bring in some bricks. Let's set the sorting layer. Let's set them pretty high. Put this tile as well. Let's create like a wall here. Put those there. Put this here. So what you could do here. So you have this wall here. Normally, when you go over here, you can see through the wall. And in a lot of games, that's completely fine, in my opinion. It doesn't matter. Oh, you're actually going below it. But if you want, you could. I'm gonna create a white block really fast. So let's drag that in here as well. Where are you? Okay. For this, you want to actually set the sorting layer higher than neither of the circles. What you want to do though is, let's put it over here like this. So if we turn this completely green, so red value to 0 and blue value to 0. And make a change to our shader that adds the green value of the pixels to the alpha value. Let's also put this on the bright layer, so fog of war main. What this should do is it blocks the vision completely. So you just have you have blackness on the other side. Obviously, it doesn't get removed at any point. On that, you would have to like, I don't know, place a trigger box here that removes it, or have a ray cast, I guess. So it dynamically removes those, but that works pretty fine as well. So you can create blockers like that with this system as well. And the last thing I wanted to show is like, sprite masks also work pretty well with this. Let's say we want to create an enemy. Just gonna use a player sprite with this. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So thing is, yeah, you don't see it behind the black, but it's still visible in the fog of war, and you necessarily don't want it. Luckily, Unity has a really good sprite mask system. I can just make a new mask, use the same circle sprite for this, make it the same size as our field of vision, and also for the enemy, make the mask interaction that's only visible inside mask. So now we go by the enemy, we see it, but at the moment he gets left behind, in the fog of war, he disappears. So that's pretty cool as well, I guess. But yeah, that's about it for this. And one last thing I wanted to mention was these errors I keep getting. These happen when you're using bigger render textures while editing. I haven't seen any actual effect with them. Like, Unity still works fine, the game still starts fine, but that might be something to look into at some point. But yeah, I hope you got something out of this tutorial, and if you have any optimization tips or hints, please leave them in the comments. But thank you for watching. Bye.